You will do well to turn to the first chapter of Esther, and we'll get there shortly. Tonight's lesson is the risk of standing up to power and authority. The series is based on the events in Esther, is faith and risking everything. One of the faith lessons in the book of Esther that you will see, that you will find, really from the very beginning of it in chapter 1, is how God is present in every challenge and in everyday events. Now, with that being said, we also find that God is also there in the most extreme of times as well. Now, that's important to understand, even though God is not mentioned in the book. But principles and God and God's people are throughout. And though God is not mentioned in the text, we find Him in Esther's courage. And we find Him in the salvation, His intent on saving His people, the Jews, Israel. Now, I think this is good to know, by the way, that God is active and busy and working for the good of His people, even if we don't notice that He is there, that we don't feel His presence, in that subjective sort of way, and we don't understand what's going on and how God is working. But do you ever wonder when we have to exercise our faith during struggling times, challenging times, and at risky times, do you ever wonder what God is doing in all this? What we see in our world today? The things that we see others going through, that we pray that as much as we pray for them to overcome, that they don't come to us in that degree. Do you ever wonder what God is doing? Do you ever wonder where God is? Do you ever wonder why we don't see more of what we want to see? I think part of the reason is we don't see what God actually is doing. The faith and the strength and the encouragement that so many people are exhibiting. Have you ever considered what you would do? And this is the stuff that kind of just gives me the willies a little bit. Do you ever consider what you would do if you had to make a hard stand for Christ? And make that hard stand for Christ, for truth, about faith, and you have to do it at home with the people that you love. Or if you had to do that hard stand, make that hard stand at work, where your job can be in the balance, your income, your family's living, and you had to make a hard stand at work. It's one thing to make it at home. They're your family. They've got to love you. But they don't got to love you at work. And they can just as easily say, see you later. Now, what about making a hard stand at school, guys? At school, where there's always a risky situation. There's always a price to pay. Being different or being godly or being moral and ethical as opposed to what else you might see. Sometimes you even have to make a stand at church. Doesn't make sense, does it? But sometimes you do. A hard stand. So this is what we can learn from the life of Esther. It applies to so many things that we see today. Living by faith in God is risky business, folks. Living by faith in God is always going to be a challenge. And sometimes in this risky business of Christianity, in faith in God and Jesus as our Savior and God as our Heavenly Father, sometimes we have to make a stand against power and authority. Sometimes that power and authority could be in your home. That power and authority can be at work. That power and authority can be at school. And that power and authority can be at church too. That is the way of it. And those are the challenges that people have gone through for a millennium, for a long time. Those are the type of challenges that people have gone through since people first started calling on the name of the Lord. What I'm trying to say is what we see as, man, we've never tread these roads before. This is new to us. It's not new to others. It's not new in this world. We have seen this before. Have you ever read the Bible? Have you ever started in Genesis and read all the way to Revelation? And on nearly every single page, you find God's people struggling in one way or another. And God said He'll see us through if we walk by faith, stay in the light, and be faithful to the end. We'll take off and jump off from where we were this morning. So it's important consideration for people of faith. Now tonight, what we're going to see is that there are even people in the Bible that don't have faith in God, and we see them make a very strong stand and wonder, wow, where did that come from? Where did that strength come from? They don't have God. They don't have the Spirit. They don't have belief in God as we understand it. And yet, wow, they made a tough stand. They paid a hard price, but they did it anyway. And it sometimes can even put people of faith to shame, to see people who are not of God doing those things. So if a person who doesn't have God in their life, if they can make a stand on what is right as far as they understand it, or make stands against power and authority when it's abusive, how much more should we do it? And we have faith and we have belief. We have God. Greater is He that is in me than he that is in the world. We have the Spirit of God within us. So we should be making the stands as well. All right, let me give you a little background and little summary quick thing about the book of Esther, because I didn't do that last week, didn't have time. We don't know who wrote the book. No, it is part of a history that we don't know who that author of history is. Author is unknown. I think as you read it, and I think that the scholars that I looked at, and I think they were pretty sharp in their assessment of it, that it was probably a Jew who was familiar with the Persians, because the detail that you have of the Persians and of the kings and of their language in their empire. And I think that shows that it was a Jew who was familiar with the circumstances of what God's people, Israel, was going through there. The book is also told from a Jewish perspective, though. From obviously, written like a Jew that has something in this, and that is looking at it and understanding the way things were, the plight of the Jews, and the concern of God's people being murdered, being killed, being wiped out. So I would expect that a Jewish person wrote this. And so the author was also probably an eyewitness of the events, at least during that reign of Xerxes, where we have Esther and her reign and the things that were going on with her. Some have even suggested that Mordecai, her cousin, the one that loved her and took care of her, that perhaps Mordecai was the author. We don't know, but those are some good guesses. But the book is about, it's named for and about a woman named Esther, who was a young Jewish girl whose Jewish name was Hadassah. And she was taken from her guardian Mordecai, and then she was, really forced to compete for the affection of the king. This competition along with other women. But we'll get into all that and how it happened. But when she was crowned king, she was renamed Esther, that Persian name that means star. Now, what is the setting for the book of Esther? The setting in which, the historical context. The events of the book occurred during the reign of King Xerxes, who chose Esther to be his queen. Now, during this time of this, and you need to notice where it is in your Bible. It's placed correctly: Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, so you can understand the timing and the time of Israel for that. It was during King Xerxes, during the time period that we find it. The first remnant of the Jews had gone back to Judah to reestablish temple worship according to the law of Moses. And for whatever reason, Mordecai, Esther, and other Jews had chosen not to go back to Israel and to Judah, at least at that time. Now, The story of Esther does not, of Queen Esther, does not begin with Queen Esther. It begins with a different queen. And this first queen, Queen Vashti, talks about how she stood up to the king. And how this woman stood up to this king and would not allow herself to be mistreated by this king, by this man. When we read about his actions, it's kind of hard to call him a man, or at least not much of one. Now, King Xerxes, now I'm going to give you my take. This is my description of him. King Xerxes was a rich, powerful, arrogant drunk. The way that you see him in chapter 1, this is the kind of man that you see. And so part of me says, when people who are like that act in the way that we see them later, it shouldn't surprise us. Why are we so surprised when people of the world act like people of the world? Why are we so surprised and shocked when people who don't believe in God, who don't have the quote, the moral fiber that God gives people by His Spirit, and we're shocked that people think in the way that they do, act in the way that they do, run after the things that they do that are ungodly, and we're just shocked. They act like the world. They are who they are. So Xerxes, this rich, powerful, arrogant man, decided to show off his wealth and show off his own splendor and his own glory. Kind of sounds like Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar had to pay a high price for a lot of his pride and all that. Look at chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media. The princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed his vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. Now, when I read words like that, all it shows is a man that is showing off. He is proud of himself. It is all about him. Now, wealth and power, unchecked, people like that, they are bound to take it to extremes, to let it go to their head, to use it not for the good of anybody else, but to their own glory and their own majesty. And that's what we see right here. Now look at verse 7 and 8. Now, okay, remember all this, the big party, the big 180-day event, and then the 7-day banquet. Verse 7 says this: wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. So he was very generous with wine. Very nice of him. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink in his own way. For the king's command, each guest was allowed, or by the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink in his own way. For the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Now, as we go on here, what Xerxes is trying to do, at least, the way that I read this, he is ingratiating himself to his people. It's kind of like a politician buying votes. He's getting people to really like this guy who gives us the best wine and all we want. Now, it goes on. Verse 10. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine. I would like to address that for a minute. In high spirits from wine. Well, he was high, all right. We know what that means. But going into verse 11, So when he is in this state, folks, he was drunk. He was drunk. How many drunk people make good decisions? How many people that are high on wine are in making the best decisions, well thought out, thinking things through, polite and being considerate of other people? That does not happen very often. Verse 7 says, this is what he did. He commanded that his eunuchs, it says in verse 11, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. And so the king makes this drunken man makes his drunken decision to basically parade his beautiful wife in front of all the other people who were drunk at this wine fest. Lord knows what was going on, reading between the lines. And take into account they are pagans. So your mind can just go pretty much anywhere. I think their minds were pretty much going in those places. And so he makes this decision to parade his beautiful wife, Queen Vashti, in front of, presumably, the drunken people at the party. And Vashti refused to do it. What she did was she stood up to the power and authority of her drunk husband, king. Now, first of all, that would be unheard of. You don't say no to a man that is the most powerful man, at least the most powerful man that you know, if not the most powerful man around. From Kush to India, that's a big empire. The man has all the power. He has all the authority. He can do whatever he wants. He can do whatever he wills. His will happen. And that's what we have in this situation. So, what could happen to the queen? To Queen Vashti. The king had the power and authority to have her killed. But interestingly enough, that's not what he does. It's kind of like, wait a minute, you can do this. Sounds like that would be something to kind of, that you would lose your life over. But that's not what happened. She, even though that didn't happen, she still paid a price. She paid the price for standing up for herself against the misuse of power and authority of the king and of their law. Look at verse 15. According to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? He asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. All right, so she wasn't going to do what she was told. Then in verse 16 it says, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, so that they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of nobility who have heard what the king's about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. That's what they were afraid to happen. You know what? And I can see that, by the way. If I don't know as much about their culture as I would like to, I guess I need to look deeper into that. But I can't see that type of disrespect and dishonor in their eyes is something that they would want. It would just be a calamity for the nobles and their wives and their families and law and order. That's what they're worried about. What was done to her? So what was done to someone who stood up for right and her desire not to be mistreated in that way? What was done to her? She was made an example. If you don't do what we tell you to do, we will make an example out of you. And that's what they did. They made an example out of her to scare the other women and the other wives that you better toe the line, you better do what we tell you to do. And she was made an example of what happens when you don't follow this law. If you don't follow the authority and the power of the king. 19 and 20. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never, now no, she's not Queen Vashti anymore, it's just Vashti, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also let the king give her royal position to someone else better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all this vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. My friends, this is not a matter of a wife honoring and submitting to her husband. By the way, that would not have been even in their mind the way of God's law would have made it, or the teachings of Christ or the teachings of Paul. Not the same thing at all. But it is not a matter of a wife not honoring and submitting to her husband. Her crime was that she was not going to allow her husband to dishonor her in public. Or dishonor her at all, I should say. And she paid the price for going against the authority. Now there's our segue. What happens? What can happen when you go against power and authority? I'm going to keep it in civil power, civil authority, right? In our nation. Let's just go ahead and put it there. What can happen to us? What does it say? What does the Bible say about making a stand against power and authority, and those in power and those in authority? Let us take a look. I think this is where simply let the Word speak. It speaks it way better than I can. Luke chapter 21. We're going to do some Luke and Acts, because that way we can go through quick. Luke 21:12. Go, go, go. Let's go. Because I got 9 minutes left. And I need... Luke 21 verse 12. Jesus gives the warning. Be ready for this. All right? Get them ready. This is before the death of Jesus. But before all this, they will lay hands on you and persecute you. They will deliver you to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name. This will result in your being witnesses to them. But make up your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourselves, for I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. Guys, they are going to arrest you. They're going to drag you in front of the authorities, the ones in the synagogues, and then all the way to the top. Jesus said it would happen, and guess what? Jesus is a prophet, is He not? The prophet. And exactly what He said is exactly what happened to His people. Acts chapter 4. Acts chapter 4. Trey, you read Acts chapter 5 passage, right? Okay. All right, so this is what happened before what Trey read. It's all the same event, but this was one interaction before. To stop this thing, this Christian thing, from spreading any further among the people, we must warn these men to speak no longer to anyone in this name. Then they called them, that's Peter and John, they called them in again and commanded them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John replied, judge for yourselves what is right in God's sight, to obey you rather than God, for we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. After further threats, they let them go. When they got picked up again, they warned them again, but beat them. All right? It's getting more intense. Now, chapter 4, chapter 5, when we start getting to chapter 6, and chapter 7, and chapter 8, and chapter 9, chapter 10, then it really starts to take off, obviously, about people who make stands and they are persecuted for their Christianity. Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas are on a mission trip. Paul did a wonderful thing by freeing this young girl of an evil spirit. He was arrested for it. He and Silas, they were thrown into prison. They were beaten severely. They were put in the dungeon, feet in stocks, and they were broken out of jail in that wonderful, miraculous, angelic way. And then later, they were released. But this is what happened. Verse 35, when it was daylight, the magistrates sent their officers to the jailer with the order, release those men. The jailer told Paul, the magistrates have ordered that you and Silas be released. Now you can leave, go in peace. But Paul said to the officers, they beat us publicly and without trial, even though we are Roman citizens, and threw us into prison. And now they want to get rid of us quietly? No. Let them come themselves and escort us out. The officers reported this to the magistrates, and they heard that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens. They were alarmed. They came to appease them and escort them from the prison, requesting them to leave their city. What did Paul and Silas demand? Our rights as citizens. You cannot treat us this way. And it scared them. Now, that's not the only time that happened. We fast forward, Acts 22. Paul is in trouble again. That's his life. That's what Jesus said would happen to him. Remember when the Lord told who baptized him? Ananias. I'm going to lose my preaching certificate on that one. The Lord said, I'm going to show him how much he's going to suffer for my name. And so all those words obviously came true. And so as a crowd wanted to rip Paul apart, the Romans stepped in to take care of the situation, but they were going to just go ahead and just flog him there pretty much on the spot. So verse 25 in Acts 22, as they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, that Roman soldier, right? The chief soldier. Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't been found guilty? When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. What are you going to do? He asked. This man is a Roman citizen. The commander himself went to Paul and asked, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? Yes, I am, he answered. Then the commander said, I had to pay a big price for my citizenship, but I was born a citizen, Paul replied. Those who were about to question him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. Now, what do we find there? Again, what does Paul do? He invokes his rights. How do we take that? We have rights. And we believe we've been given rights that are given by God himself. And no government gave me my rights. God gave me my rights. And so what we see is a man of God. You don't see him being ugly. You see him being firm. You don't see him in any way, and any abusive. He's nowhere or no way but polite in these dealings. But he is still firm. I will not have my rights trampled. We need to keep those things in mind. And it reminds me about the things that Jesus said would happen to them are the same things that can happen to us or will happen to us as disciples of Jesus. And if I could give you any advice about how I look at these things, because I'm way, way, way out of time, I just want to tell you, think about what Jesus said about how we respond in any hard situation. What are the things that Jesus said? Jesus said in Matthew 5 to be peacemakers. He tells those to pray for those who persecute us, and then to consider yourself blessed when people insult you or say false things about you. Just to simply realize, hey, I'm still blessed, and whatever they say cannot hurt me in that way. Jesus also said in Matthew 5, settle matters quickly with your adversary who is going to take you to court. Try to get it done. Try to make amends, or at least try to come to some type of agreement. Jesus is trying to tell his people. Love your neighbor as you should. Pray for your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, forgive other people as you have been forgiven. Matthew chapter 7. Verse 6, Jesus said, don't give dogs what is sacred. Don't throw your pearls to swine. So be careful with what you've got and the message that you have. It's not always right to give your testimony in that way. But this is what I want you to go away with. I want you to go away with two facts, two biblical facts. And in these, here is a real scenario and then also just a biblical treatise that will help us a lot. The fact is that sometimes when we make a stand, we will be successful. That will stand up for our rights, that will stand up for what is right and true and godly. And sometimes we will win the day. And guess what will happen on the other day? Sometimes it will not go our way. And it makes us mad. And we hit the internet. And we start getting our blood boiling. And boy, we start looking at rights. Start hearing First Amendment rights and Second Amendment rights and all. I'm sorry, all the way down. I'm choking myself up, but listen to... All right, my voice is raw for the day. Hebrews 10, and let's read it together. Hebrews 10:32. Here's the real scenario, and then I'll give you the real teaching that will help us. Hebrews 10:32. None of this is new. None of this is new. So if we keep that in mind, if we act like Christians, we're going to be okay. Christians are going to be okay. Not happy with everything, but we're going to be okay. Remember those earlier days after you had received the light, when you stood your ground in a great contest in the face of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecutions. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You sympathized with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. There you go. Sometimes you stand your ground and it works. Sometimes you stand your ground and man, it doesn't work. And sometimes you just have to say, and this is, I'm going to just put this in vernacular. Sometimes the best thing to say is, whatever. Whatever. You're going to take my house? You're going to take away my tax-exempt status at the Waters Road Church? I'm not saying roll over now. I'm just saying, you know what? We have other things to do and concentrate on besides this stuff. And I have to tell you, folks, pretty much, this is all I hear. I don't hear the gospel. I don't hear love. I don't hear grace. I don't hear help. The majority of what I hear and see and read is this stuff here. Don't get so caught up in it that you forget the other things. How are we going to overcome the things that are actually evil? The things that we see are evil. How do we overcome evil? We overcome evil with good. Romans 12, verse 21. That's it. Let's stand and sing.